Good morning, everyone. I can still see people still streaming in. In my head, I'm imagining everyone coming into a lecture theatre, and the numbers are still rocking up. Welcome to the first in our series of 6 webinars on evaluating causal impact. First one being an introduction to causal evaluation. And this session will be delivered by Katie Jones and Lauren Valera of the Brilliant Club. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. And just to note that this session will be recorded. I can see the numbers still climbing up, so I'm again assuming that people are squeezing in through the doors at the front of the lecture theatre. And we'll just give it a minute or two longer before we get going. Okay, numbers seem to have slowed down a bit, so I am delighted to begin the first in our series of 6 webinars on evaluating causal impact. I'm going to pass over to Katie Jones and Lauren Valera of the Brilliant Club.
Lovely, thank you so much, Rob, and it's really lovely to see so many people on the call. So this is the first webinar in our series. So it's an introduction to causal evaluation. Just to give a bit more background about myself and Katie, so we work for the Brilliant Club, which is a university access charity, and so we run a range of university access and student success interventions across the UK. We are, as part of that, we have a research and impact function, and within that we offer consultancy. So we work directly with organisations and with universities to support them with their evaluation work. We've been working with TASTE on this sector-wide project for the last 9 months. And so what I'll do to begin with is I'll just talk you through sort of a little bit about the background of the project, and then we will talk about causal evaluations. Okay, so in terms of the project, and the sort of impetus for the project was that we know conducting causal evaluations or conducting evaluations that generate causal evidence is a really challenging thing to do, especially within real life settings. And so TASO really wanted to know what are the enablers and what are the barriers to developing more causal evidence, especially in relation to university access and student success. We worked on this project with academics from the University of Cambridge. So many of you may know Dr. Sonia Ilya, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education. Sonia will be joining us for some of the later webinars in the series. And what we were really doing within this project is we were doing a consultation. So you can see from the very large numbers on the screen that we had really good engagement from across the sector. We spoke to sort of a range of universities, and I just also want to use this as an opportunity to thank everybody for engaging with the consultation. One of the key findings was around the knowledge gap. And so the knowledge gap to do with evaluation designs, which then generate causal evidence. And then another key finding was around wanting more practical resources to run these types of evaluations. And so these webinars are very much addressing those 2 points. And so supporting around the knowledge, but also supporting with some of the practical resources as well. And we're very much contributing to the resources that TASO already have. And so we're really adding to the resource bank in general. Okay, so just to kind of give an overview of what the causal impact series looks like. So in total, there are 5 webinars, and we will be running them between June and July. So the first one is, of course, today, which is a very sort of broad introduction to causal evidence. And then the subsequent webinars, so we have one on QEDs, and then we have one on RCDs as well. With the latter 2 sessions, we are calling them evaluation surgeries. And so that's an opportunity for you to ask questions and also for you to get more personalised support. We would very strongly encourage people to attend all of the webinars, because they really will be building on each other across the series. As who will be running the webinar? So as I mentioned, myself and Katie are running today's webinar. And then later in future webinars, you'll also meet our colleague Hannah, and then also Sonia. So you'll be seeing us in various formations as we go through the series. And then thinking about the purpose of the session, so we're going to give you some information around running causal evaluations. We're also going to be responding to some of the feedback that we got from the consultation, and so focusing on some of the challenges and also some of the enablers. Katie will talk us through some of the practical steps in implementation guidance that's available. And then we will also have some time for a Q&A, as if that will be an opportunity for you to ask any questions, but also more broadly, if you want to share any of your own personal evaluation experiences. So on that note, we will get going into the webinar content itself. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so why do we need more causal evidence? And so before we think about why we need causal evidence, it's really helpful to think about what do we mean? What do we mean by causal evidence? And so often we make this distinction between causation and correlation. And so a correlation is an association or a relationship. And so we often talk about as one variable increases, another variable increases, or as one variable increases, another decreases. But so crucially, when we're looking at association, we don't know what is causing what. As we don't know which variable is causing which outcome. We also don't know if there's another variable which is involved. And so association is just kind of one bit of the sort of research methods puzzle. If we sort of contrast that with causation, and so causation is around if you're isolating, so you're isolating and identifying a particular effect. And so in the context of the work we're doing, so university access and student success work, we have an intervention, and then we want to be confident that it's causing a particular outcome. This is also referred to by the Office for Students as type 3 evidence. And so also in type 3 evidence, essentially is sort of used interchangeably. And then we'll come back to talking about the levels of evidence for the Office for Students a little bit later on. Okay, so a sort of important question, quite a big question, why do we need more causal evidence? Well, fundamentally, we want more information about what interventions and what activities are working, but also what's not working. So we can really ensure that we're investing our resources and our efforts in the best possible ways in order to maximise outcomes for students. And so we need more causal evidence in order to do this. And just sort of coming back to the levels and standards of evidence by the Office for Students, which a lot of us are sort of working to within the university access and student success space. We are seeing what we know is we already have a lot of type 1 evidence. And so this is the sort of narrative and the rationale around your interventions. And so you'll be drawing on things like wider research. We know there's been a lot of work across the sector gone into your theory of changes. We also know with the access and participation plans that again really kind of building up your narrative has been a really important part of doing that. Secondly, we have type 2, and so this is empirical evidence, but what we don't have is that causal aspect. And so, for example, type 2, we might be doing pre-post, and so we might be doing a pre-questionnaire and a post-questionnaire, for example. With type 2, we may also have some kind of comparison group, but crucially, we aren't doing random allocation. We don't know if the groups are similar. And so in order really to get that causal evidence, we need type 3. But within this sort of at the moment, we do have limited type 3 evidence. We do have some type 3 evidence. That's sort of relative to what we have in type 1 and type 2, it is sort of definitely a bit more limited. And so just drawing upon Taso's toolkit, so there are currently only 2 types of interventions. And so that's pre-university tutoring, information, advice and guidance, where we have three or more pieces of type 3 evidence. And so collectively across the sector, we know we want to be producing and generating more of this evidence. Okay, so the next question, how can we generate causal evidence? And so I'm briefly going to talk through the different types of methods. And then what we'll be doing in the subsequent webinars is we'll be talking through each of these approaches in more detail. And so this is a bit of an overview, and then we will move through to talking about some more practical guidance as well. Okay, so just sort of thinking about the sort of mechanisms and the ways you can demonstrate causality. And so ideally what we want to be doing, so we have our intervention or we have our activity, and we want to know what is the causal impact on a particular outcome or on a particular set of outcomes. But the difficulty is, and the challenge is that alongside your intervention within the real world, we also have what we call confounders or confounding variables, as a bunch of other stuff is happening at the same time. And so it's really difficult to know what is causing the outcome of interest. And so is it our intervention or is it the other sort of factors which are happening at the same time? What we're trying to do by running evaluations that generate causal evidence is we're isolating what is the impact of this specific intervention on these outcomes, and we are controlling for all of the other confounding variables. And again, what I'll do is I'll talk through the different ways we can do this and we can think about this in general. Okay, so the key question is when we're thinking about a counterfactual, the question we're asking is what would have happened had the intervention not taken place? And so what would that counterfactual be? If the intervention didn't happen, what would have happened? And so this is what we refer to as having a counterfactual. And so this is also helpful because this is really the key question and the essence of what we're trying to address when we're doing evaluations that will be generating causal evidence. Within the counterfactual, essentially what we are doing is we're taking away the intervention, or we're taking away the activity that you're interested in, and we are tracking what the outcomes would have been without the intervention. And so we're separating the intervention from all of the confounding variables, which you can see on the right-hand side. Just sort of picking up on a couple of specific points here. And so the reasons why we need a counterfactual. So number one is around avoiding selection bias. And so this is about making sure so where there are systematic differences between the participants and non-participants. And so this isn't what we want to happen, because we want to know that the groups of individuals we're looking at are similar. And so what we don't want is systematic differences between the two groups of interest. For example, there could be differences in motivation. Secondly, we want to, when we're creating our counterfactual, we want to be avoiding confounding variables. What we are trying to achieve is we're trying to achieve the sort of making sure the participants who take part in your intervention and your activity, in your non-participants, your people who are not taking part in the intervention, and so who are creating your counterfactual, we want to make sure that there is similarity. So where participants and non-participants are very different on observable and unobservable characteristics, we want to be avoiding that. because we want to be really confident that what is causing the outcome is the intervention and not the confounding variables. We'll talk a little bit later on about some of the techniques around matching, for example, and so making sure that there isn't a systematic difference between your two groups, but also we've also accounted for any confounds. And then what we're going to do now, I'm going to briefly talk through the different ways you can create a counterfactual. And so the first way is using a source of variation or change externally. Secondly, we're going to look at the random assignment. So that's between intervention and control group. I think this is what we call an RCT, or randomized control trial. We're then going to talk about statistically generating a comparison. And so this is a QED or a quasi experimental method. We will, in subsequent webinars, we will be talking through this in a lot more detail. And so today, we're sort of resetting the scene. And then we will, the next couple of webinars, there will be sort of additional layers of detail. Okay, so thinking about the first way of creating a counterfactual. So this is based on external or exogenous source of variation. And so this is when you have a natural experiment. And so it's not what we call a true experiment, because for it to be a true experiment, you have to be in control of the variation. But natural experiments, they are quite common within the work we do. And they can provide good causal evidence. As an example, if you're running a large-scale program and you're running it across the UK, you just sort of through the practice of your implementation in your delivery, you may be delivering it in some schools, but not others. We may be delivering it in some places and not others. And so because it's at scale, this help that it gives you sort of a group of individuals who are taking part in the intervention, and then a group of individuals who are not taking part in the intervention, or who will be taking part in the intervention at a later time point. And so this is sort of particularly useful when you have very large data sets, and you have that range. Okay, so the other way, and this is where you are creating your counterfactual sort of directly. And so the first way is the RCT, so your randomized controlled trial. You are within this, you are randomly assigning your participants to different groups. And so we talk about sort of intervention, which is your activity or your program you're delivering. And then we also talk about your control. And so that is your counterfactual, right? That is your group of individuals who are not taking part in the intervention, but otherwise are similar to your individuals who are taking part in the intervention. And we will talk about in the third webinar, that webinar is focused on RCTs, but we will talk about the different ways you can do randomization. And so you can do randomization on an individual level, you can do randomization on a group level. And we will talk through the different sort of advantages and disadvantages of those different random allocation techniques. With your QED, so your quasi experimental design, you are using statistical methods to create your comparison group. And to do this, you will need very big data sets in order to do the matching effectively. But just to kind of talk through a bit more detail, as with RCTs, they are really common, and in fact, they're the most common experimental designs within education. As if we think about things like the Education Endowment Foundation, for example, what we will be covering within the subsequent webinars is really talking through the different types of designs, and then what that means in terms of the interpretation in the results of the data based on those designs. We are so thinking about your QED, as in what you're trying to do here is you're trying to create a comparison group that is as similar as possible to the intervention group. And so you do this based on the data you have. And so just to give a very concrete example, if you're interested in the effect of bursaries on student outcomes, you might have a threshold where you're cutting off students. So if they're above a certain threshold, they will receive a bursary, and if they're below, they will not receive a bursary. And so what we do there is we take the students that have just been cut off below, and we use that to create your comparison group. And so that's just one example of the techniques you can use. In the next webinar, which is next Thursday, we will be talking about that in more detail. Okay, so what I'm going to do now before handing over to Katie, who will talk through some more of the practical elements, I just want to reflect on the feedback we received from the consultation. As these were common concerns about causal evaluations. And in total there are 5. And so I'm going to go through each in turn, and I'm just sort of going to give some sort of initial sort of reflections and solutions. So one of the biggest concerns based on the consultation was around, if we have a control group, this means that some individuals will not be receiving the intervention, and so therefore potentially they're missing out on an activity which is effective. And so thinking about this from a sort of methods perspective, both within your QED and in your RCTs, there are ways which you can ensure that your participants eventually receive your intervention. So we sort of talk about it as a waitlist design. We will be touching upon this in the next couple of webinars, and so what this means in practice and the best way to implement it. The sort of other point around this is, until we have the causal evidence or the type 3 evidence, we don't know whether the intervention is having a positive impact on these outcomes. And so based on that alone, it's really important that we're engaging with these causal evaluations. But as I said, within the way you do the designing, there are options to make sure that participants, depending on what you're doing, and there are options to make sure that participants do receive the intervention at a later time point. The second concern was around external factors on the outcome, so the influence of external factors on the outcome that we can't control for. So this is the purpose and the point of using these types of designs, because what we are doing is we're maximising the similarity between the intervention and the control or the comparison groups. And so the only difference that is left is the fact that one group is receiving the intervention and the other group is not receiving the intervention. And so essentially the sort of mechanism of these designs are really set up to ensure that we're making sure that the confounding variables are not impacting the outcomes. Okay, point number 3. And this came up quite a lot, and I think it's a really important and a really valid point, this sort of tension between the quantitative and qualitative research. We especially when you're doing sort of, QEDs or RCTs, it's really important to have that qualitative research as well. So especially around implementation and process evaluation. And so we very much see these as 2 sort of connected things. We're ultimately, whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative will depend on your research questions, but there's lots of space and room for both of these types of methodologies within the same evaluation. And we wouldn't advise somebody to do a quantitative evaluation without having some form of qualitative as well, and vice versa. Point number 3, which is a genuine and very legitimate concern, especially within the work we are doing. So the challenge around, we don't have a big enough sample for an RCT or a QED. So the first thing to say is, so for a QED, yes, you do need very large sample sizes, because you need to make sure you're creating a similar comparison group. With your RCT, because you're doing that random allocation, you are, in terms of the samples, they can be a little bit smaller, and it's sort of a couple of hundred is sort of quite realistic and quite feasible. But we do recognise that there are instances where actually the samples are very small. And so if that is the case, then a QED or an RCT won't necessarily be the most appropriate method. And so this also just to highlight Tase's work on small ends. And so they have a set of resources on their website around this. And so what do you do if you do have those very small sample sizes? And then another option is sort of within this is thinking about the way we can collaborate as a sector to increase sample sizes. And again, I know Taste is sort of very much leading the way in terms of sector-wide RCTs and sort of bringing really sort of essentially bolstering our sample sizes through collaboration across the sector, which is also another really effective way to do this. I forgot to click this. That's what I just said basically in terms of considering other approaches that don't need huge sample sizes, or thinking about the way you can be creative in terms of bringing those sample sizes together. And remembering with your RCT, actually the sample size required is often a lot smaller than a QED. Point number 5, which is also a very good point indeed. So what about type 2 evaluation with a comparison group? And so we know you can have type 2 evidence, which also includes a comparison group. The thing is with this is that just because there's a comparison group, if it's not similar to your intervention group, that won't help you to generate type 3 evidence. I think we need to be really confident that we're comparing like with like overall, and in order to do that, we need to be adopting and using either your RCT or your QED methodology. And again, I forgot to click, so I will click through there. And so the nature of the comparison really does matter. Okay, so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the common concerns, and we're very happy also to pick this up as part of the Q&A. And on that note, I'll pass over to Katie, who will talk to us about what this needs to look like in practice. So over to you, Katie. We'll be doing a bit of a next slide routine as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. So one of the main bits of feedback that we got from the sector consultation is that people really want this discussion around the practical steps of conducting these kinds of evaluations. So we're going to go through a few slides on some of the practicalities. Essentially, as with any kind of evaluation, you'll be working your way through the evaluation cycle. So this is Tase's evaluation cycle, where you start with phase 1, which is diagnose, and you are creating your theory of change, which is essentially your logic model outlining how your intervention is going to cause that direct impact on an outcome or outcomes of interest. So you'll need that in place. Then you'll go through to phase 2, where you're planning your evaluation and you're setting out your research protocol in detail. Then phase 3, where you're actually implementing or measuring. So you're either collecting data or you're accessing existing data sets and you're analysing them and interpreting the findings. And then you go through to phase 4, where you're reflecting on what these findings mean for practice and you're sharing those findings with the sector. So we're going to go through those phases one at a time, but this is a very useful framework for that. So Lauren, if you could go on to the next slide. One of the big things that came up in the sector consultation is that providers are saying they've got a really wide portfolio of interventions, and because these kind of type 3 causal evaluations are quite resource intensive, it can be challenging to identify the best candidate to focus on for causal evaluation. So I just wanted to go through some of the factors that you can consider when you're making this decision. So first of all, look to the evidence gaps. It would be great if we're doing RCTs and QEDs that kind of build that causal evidence base that we don't currently have. But also you can build and strengthen existing evidence bases. You will want to consider whether your intervention leads itself to the kinds of research questions that can be answered by causal evaluations. So as Lauren's mentioned, a causal evaluation is essentially asking, does this intervention have a direct causal impact on a particular outcome of interest? So that is what an RCT and a QED is designed to answer. You'll also want to select an intervention where you already have a solid theory of change. You want a really grounded understanding of why you think your intervention is having the impact that you will hope to find through your evaluation. So you'll want an intervention with that already in place. An important one is to think about what kind of counterfactuals may be available for your intervention. So is there a natural kind of comparison group that already exists? Will you need to create one from scratch? All of these things will determine whether you can do a randomized control trial or a QED. Importantly, you'll want to pick an intervention that has really well-defined outcomes, and those that are very measurable. So that will be one of the determining factors. And then an interesting one that we will definitely go into in more detail in further future webinars is this idea of sample size. So for different designs and for different effects that you're measuring, you'll require different sample sizes. And if you aren't able to achieve that sample size, then you're not yet ready to conduct an RCT or a QED for that particular intervention. But we will touch on that in more detail later. So if you can move on. So you've identified which intervention you want to evaluate. You then have to make sure that you have the right expertise and resources in place. As you're probably aware, QEDs and RCTs can be quite resource intensive, and you don't want to go too far and having made either errors in your protocol or not being able to analyze the data effectively. So you will need to make sure you have access to someone who is skilled in your chosen evaluation design and someone who can conduct the relevant statistical analyses that you will need. So you need access to that. You also need to consider your delivery team. So you'll need practitioners who have that deep understanding of how your program works. You'll potentially need your data managers and those who can support with data collection. So those will be part of your evaluation team as well. And then one thing to consider is whether you have all this expertise already in-house, in which case brilliant, or whether you'll need to go and find external support. And external support can be essentially running the whole evaluation as an external evaluation, or you can get someone in to do elements of the evaluation like setting up the protocol or analysing the data. Next slide. So if you have your team in place, the next thing you'll need to do is create your research protocol, which is essentially a really detailed layout of all the elements of your evaluation. What I would recommend is you go onto the TASO website and you find their TASO protocol template. So that will essentially walk you through everything you'll need in your protocol. And your protocol is also really important for gaining ethical approval from your institution. So we do recommend that you take some time to understand what the ethical approval process is within your institution and what information they require. It can be quite a time-consuming process to gain ethical approval, so you will need to think about this as far ahead as possible. You'll need to submit things like consent forms, and think about who you're getting consent from and how, whether it's participants and potentially even parents and carers. And again, there's lots of ethical guidance on the TASO website, so look at that as well. And then Lauren, if you can, yeah, thank you. And then, so you've got your approval, you've got your protocol, you are now in the stage of implementing your evaluation. One of the practicalities that you'll really need to consider is the consequences of running something like a randomized controlled trial on the standard delivery cycle. So a randomized controlled trial can really extend and have quite a lengthy time frame because you have to consider all the activities that you'll be conducting before the program is delivered and also afterwards. So all the planning, all the recruitment, all the comms that needs to be sent out to schools if you're working with schools. And then when you get the data, it's also going to take time to analyze it, create reports and share that. So you've got to be really upfront with the timeframes in which these things are going to happen. So what we recommend is that you create a time frame from the very beginning that outlines all these different activities. And then you need to consider what impact this may have on the partnerships and the participants that you're working with, especially if your causal evaluation is going to require more from them than you would typically ask for with a normal kind of delivery cycle. And this is also true for your wider team. So just be really clear with their roles and responsibilities for what additional tasks they'll need to do to get an RCT or a QED underway, whether that's data collection or support with recruitment. So just to give you a sense of a time frame for the TASO RCT that they did on summer schools, the timeline begins in January of 2022. And then obviously the summer schools were delivered over the summer holidays. So up until that time, it was all about planning the RCT. Then the programme was delivered, and then TASO published the interim report of the RCT in 2023. And now they are collecting that longer term data, which will come through in November of 2024, with the final report being published in 2025. So as you can see, there's quite a lengthy kind of turnaround from the start of the evaluation to the end, and you'll just have to be really clear about this with your different stakeholder groups. So if we can move on to the next one. Okay, so this is an interesting point that I want to hit home, which is when you get all your data in, at the point of analysis, the first thing you want to consider is whether your study has ended up being sufficiently large enough to draw a conclusion from the data about the impact of the intervention. So we refer to this as statistical power, and it's definitely a topic we'll be tackling in the kind of more detailed webinars. It's not quite as simple as just thinking about the size of the sample that you have at the stage of analysis, but that is an essential component of the deliberation. But essentially, you'll need to find out whether your study has been large enough to give you the statistical precision to be able to draw conclusions that will allow you to interpret the results. However, it may be the case that your study ends up not being sufficiently large enough, even if you intended to collect a large amount of data. And that could be for a number of reasons. So it could be that you had dropouts of participants from the trial, or you had issues with data collection, or maybe there were issues with data quality. So you ended up with a smaller study than you thought you were going to have. And unfortunately, what this means is you won't have the statistical precision to be able to say anything about the impact of your study. So that's something that you'll have to be aware of. So what I would say is when you're at the initial stages of planning your QED or RCT, what you'll need to think about is how much dropout you might expect to happen over the course of the evaluation, and also take a very cautious approach to collecting good data from as many participants as possible, because the aim is that you will have to have a sufficiently large enough study to be able to say anything about your findings. So now we're going to move on to what we'll be able to say if you did get a large enough sample. So you will get any one of these three different outcomes. So you might find that you've got a statistically significant positive effect. And this is the idea that the intervention has had a positive impact on the outcome or outcomes of interest. You might have a statistically significant negative effect, and this is where the intervention has had a negative impact on the outcome of interest. Or you might have a null effect, which is that the intervention has had no impact on the outcome. Now, if your result is significant, you'll want to interpret this in light of your theory of change. So you'll want to look back at your theory of change and your original research questions and hypotheses. You'll also want to look at any documentation about how the programme was delivered, and your process evaluation to really understand what may have led to this significant result. So that's all part of your interpretation. Interestingly, if we think about a significantly negative effect, so the intervention having negative impact on the outcome, this could actually be desirable. So, for example, if you have an intervention that's aimed at reducing a negative experience or reducing the incidence of an adverse effect, then you'll actually be wanting to see a negative effect. However, if you're getting a negative effect that you weren't expecting, this is very valuable knowledge. So you've got to think about the ethical implications for your intervention. You'll want to ask yourself, do I want to continue this intervention if it's having a negative effect, or do I need to change the intervention? So that's all useful knowledge to have. Now, if we come to the null effect, so you found that the intervention has had no impact on the outcome, this again could be due to a number of reasons. So first of all, it may be that the intervention genuinely made no difference to the outcome of interest, in which case, again, you might want to consider the future of the intervention, whether you want to stop it or whether you want to change aspects of the intervention. You may want to evaluate the intervention again, potentially looking at a different outcome of interest. So those are all possible kind of responses to a null effect. However, a null effect may also be due to implementation challenges of the programme. So when you were running the programme, perhaps certain elements weren't delivered in the way that you would expect in terms of business as usual, or maybe take-up of the programme wasn't particularly high, so you're not seeing the impact that you would expect. Or you may get a null effect because of methodological challenges of your evaluation. So perhaps there were design issues with your evaluation, or perhaps you weren't measuring the outcomes appropriately. So with this in mind, you'll need to do very careful interpretation of your findings to come up with reasons why you've got these outcomes. And it, essentially adds caveats to what you're able to say about the impact of your programme. On top of statistical significance, you also want to consider what we call effect size, and that is essentially the size of the change that the intervention is having. So, for example, if you're running a tutoring program, for example, you would want to be able to say something around whether it's having a small, a medium, or a large effect on attainment scores. And this is usually reported in a standardized way, so a percentage of a standard deviation. And the reason this is done is that you can actually compare the effect size of that particular intervention with other interventions to find out what is the most impactful on a particular outcome. So that's a really useful thing to be able to do. And then on top of effect size, you'll just generally want to think, what is the practical significance of these findings? So if you have a very, very expensive program that takes a lot of resource and it's only having a small effect on the outcome, you still may want to consider, even if it's significant, whether that is worth the time and resource or whether that resource is best placed elsewhere. So there is a lot of interpretation and decision-making you will need to do off the back of your statistical findings. So if you can move on to the next slide. So now you've got your results and you've interpreted them. The big message here essentially is, no matter what you find, please do publish your results. It's just as valuable for the sector to learn about what has not been effective as what has worked. Please do publish as widely as possible. Tazo have reporting templates that can support you to write up your findings and share them, so please do check that out. And then in terms of using the findings in practice, please do plan time to decide how you're going to act on the findings of your evaluation and how this aligns with your programme delivery cycle, so that you can adapt your intervention in good time. I appreciate that those timeframes don't always align, so it's something you need to consider in advance. And then if we move on to the next slide, and this is a really important point, is that alongside your causal impact evaluation, it's always a good idea to conduct an implementation and process evaluation, so an IPE. So where impact evaluation focuses on measuring the impact of an intervention on an outcome. Your IPE is focusing on understanding how the intervention and program was put into practice and how it operated to achieve its intended outcomes and the factors that influence the process. So it provides all that really useful contextual information. It can also help you to understand whether your causal evaluation result may have been influenced by evaluation implementation factors or delivery factors. So again, it helps you to interpret and act on your findings. And in particular, it could be very helpful to still get insights from a causal evaluation if it has a null result. So getting that contextual information, which could be getting feedback from delivery staff and also participants, is really helpful to make the most out of the findings of your causal evaluations. Okay, next slide, please. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we are very much open to questions. Bear in mind that we do also have evaluation surgeries. So if people have questions that they're kind of developing, you can also submit them for the causal evaluation surgeries that are coming up later in the summer.
You can pass that to Rob.
Thank you very much, Katie and Lauren, for that brilliant introduction to causal evaluation. If any of you do have questions for Lauren or Katie, please do put them in the Q&A section. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded and you will be able to get hold of a copy of the recording. While we're waiting for people to put some questions in, I wondered if you would be able to talk a little bit more about the consent process that you think you might need for a randomized control trial into, when you're doing a large scale trial that and you've got sort of thousands potentially of students to get consent from. What kind of options do you think you have in that situation?
We also, just to sort of touch on briefly, and so we know a lot of the evaluations are taking place from universities who already have established ethics sort of review boards and committees, and so following your institutional guidance is really important. We know when we're doing our RCTs and QEDEs, it's really around making sure we're getting informed consent from the participants, and so they know what they're participating in and what data is being collected. And so that's often via consent form and information sheets. But I will also pass to Katie, see if Katie, you have anything to add to that.
I would agree that you will need to be directed as much as possible by the ethics committee, because essentially you'll need ethics approval, but you can also make a strong case for the practicalities of achieving that consent in a particular format. So especially considering the age group that you're working with or any other sensitivities. So obviously make that clear with regards to submitting for ethical approval when you're drafting up your consent forms. But yes, you may not have as much control as you'd wish because it does have to meet ethical approval. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, the questions are literally flooding in. So I'll begin with this one from Kirsty Ross, sorry. What was the sample size for the summer school evaluations and what dropout rate did you actually experience?
That is an excellent question. I do have it on my screen somewhere, but not immediately.
I was going to say that's also probably a TASO question as well. But Katie, could just double check the sample and we can put it into the chat.
Yes, I will follow up on that in the
Okay.
chat, and then we can cover
But
that.
it is a good point around the sample sizes and the attrition you're experiencing within these types of RCTs. And so, yeah, we will drop that information into the chat for you.
Okay, thank you. Another question we've got is, I'm particularly interested in qualitative causal evidence. Have either of you done much work in this regard?
I'm mindful we can't ask persons to unmute because we're in a webinar setting, but it would be interesting to get a bit more information about what type of thing you're doing within that. So I don't know if the person who asked the question wants to type in a bit, perhaps type it into the chat box.
Okay.
I would say that with causal evaluation, we typically use that for more explorative research questions. So as much as qualitative evaluation is very useful companion to your RCTs and QEDs, and I would definitely recommend everyone does some form of qualitative research alongside to contextualize your findings. If we take an RCT for an example, a good RCT needs to have a very well-defined outcome that you are measuring and comparing across the control and intervention groups. And that's obviously more challenging with qualitative research, but I'm really interested to hear about anyone who's been doing that crossover between qualitative research and causal evaluation. It's not something I'm personally that experienced with, so that'll be good to share with the rest of the sector.
Thank you. So I've got another question here. Someone who is struggling to understand the difference between counterfactuals and confounders, and I wondered if you had an easy way to think about this.
Yeah, so the counterfactual is controlling for your confounding variables. And so you have, so within any situation, you'll have your intervention or your activity where you're trying to understand what's the impact on this outcome. But sitting alongside that, because we're constantly in real world settings, there will be other confounding variables that will be impacting. And so your counterfactual is your comparison group. And so if we go back, if I just go back quite a few slides. And so your counterfactual is removing the intervention, and then you're essentially left with it's basically the difference between your intervention and your counterfactual. We sometimes also refer to it as a control or a comparison. Is the sort of the difference between the two is one's having the intervention and one's not having the intervention. But apart from that, all of your confounding variables are basically controlled for, because the way you're doing the mechanism, so if we take an RCT, because you're randomly allocating the participants or the students to two groups, you are balancing out any systematic differences. And so you're just left with, okay, this group got the intervention and this group didn't get the intervention. Hopefully that gives a bit more clarity, but do you say if not?
Thank you. I think that does. Well, it certainly helps clear it up to my point of view. This is an interesting one, and this might be a tricky one to answer, but I think it's worthwhile asking. There are a lot of perceived difficulties in doing an RCT. In the panel's view, are there any specifics that are easier to deliver as part of an RCT rather than more challenging?
As in, yeah, you go, Katie. I'm going to think about the question a bit more.
There are definitely, it's mostly about identifying good opportunities for randomized controlled trials. So if you do happen to have a very large pool of participants and they can't all take part in an intervention, and you want a fair way of deciding who gets to take part, that lends itself to a natural randomized controlled trial. Essentially, you're randomly allocating some to take part in the intervention and some to not take part. So there are setups that really lend themselves to causal evaluations. And there are also ways of making randomized controlled trials easier on people and more palatable. So, for example, if one of the main ethical concerns is that you're withholding an intervention from a control group and you're not comfortable with that, there are designs where you can make sure that the people who are allocated to the control group know that they're going to get the intervention at a later date. That's totally fine. There are all kinds of kind of staggered rollouts of interventions. So again, everyone gets to take part. So a lot of these concerns can be addressed. And also the cleaner your evaluation design for a randomized controlled trial and the bigger the effect is, so the bigger the impact you think your intervention is having, you can also potentially have much smaller sample sizes. So there are nice, neat, small RCTs and designs that are available. And then on top of that, we have QEDs, which is a fantastic kind of untapped opportunity, because we know higher education providers have huge data sets, and you can potentially create all kinds of counterfactuals from those data sets. So you're not even going out and collecting more data, potentially. There are answers and causal insights that you can draw from there. So there are some easy wins, I would say that. So it's not all difficult.
With and just to add to that, I think also being really confident about the outcomes you're measuring and why you're measuring them. I say that also interplays with your methodology. I'd say the more robust your outcomes that are, then that also would influence your likelihood to detect an effect if one does exist.
Thank you. Yes, while you're answering, one thing that also occurred to me where an RCT might be easier is when you have capacity limitations on whatever intervention that you're introducing. And so if you've only got space for 100, but 200 apply, you could randomly allocate those 200 to receive the intervention or not, and that saves you the effort of trying to work out how on earth you're going to deliver, how are you going to rank those people otherwise if they've exceeded a threshold for meeting that intervention. I think that was used in the summer school trial, I believe, wasn't it? Okay, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. And what have we got? Is there any guidance to understand which areas we may or may not need external support when deciding how to approach an RCT? So some sort of checklist on what competencies are required.
This is a good segue, Katie. I can see you. I'll let you take this question.
So one of the main, so we did this sector consultation where we asked providers and colleagues what would be helpful, and very much this kind of like checklist approach of what you need to do an RCT and a QED was one of the main bits of feedback that we got coming through. So this also applies to external support. So Taser, we're going to think about how they guide people into identifying good support from external providers or consultants. So it's something we're currently thinking through. And I would say the piece around having someone who's got the skill set and the expertise and experience in designing QEDs and RCTs is very, very helpful. It means that you're anticipating any problems further down the line and you're having a really well-designed evaluation, and potentially also finding someone who can do the data analysis. There's the added value of having someone external kind of validating the findings by doing the analysis externally. So I would also recommend that as an approach for a number of reasons. But yes, we're thinking through the kind of step-by-step and checklist approach to helping people make sure they've got the resource and the plans in place to do a very successful RCT or QED.
Just also to reference the evaluation surgeries that will be coming later in the series, that's also an opportunity for more detailed questions in discussions. It will be sort of a bit more like a workshop format.
Thank you. Well, we're just running to time now, so I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all the questions, but I'd like to thank again Lauren and Katie for this fantastic introduction to causal impact evidence generation. The post-event communications will signpost you to the next session in the series, and we're going to be holding evaluation surgeries on the 9th and 16th of July. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.